So what events in your history led you to become a behavior analyst?
Well, I never started out to be a behavior analyst. I got an engineering degree from Cooper Union in New York City, and I never really liked engineering very much. I didn't like the 9 to 5 aspect of being an engineer, being an employee. My friends who were going to graduate school were living what I thought was a better life than I was as an engineer. So I wanted to live that sort of life, and I started going to school at night, to graduate school, working during the day, going at night as a philosophy major. So originally I started out majoring in philosophy and going to the New School in New York City, where you could take a graduate degree but go at night and work during the day. And that's what I was doing. And then I got a master's degree. So I started out in philosophy, and I began to think that philosophy was really too far away from engineering. I couldn't really understand what it is I was supposed to be learning. So I gradually switched over to psychology. I got a master's degree in psychology. And then I decided to get a PhD and go to Harvard. And even then, I had no idea of becoming a behavior analyst or a Skinnerian or anything like that. I just went there, and it turned out that in Skinner's lab was where the interesting people were. Bill Baum was there, and Alan Nuringer, and Richard Schuster was there, and Phil Heinlein was there. These all people came in on my class. They were all in my class, and they were all Skinnerians. And I just became a Skinnerian because I wanted to interact with them. They were my friends, and we had interesting discussions and arguments and yelling and screaming at each other. And so I started doing experiments. I had an idea for an experiment on punishment, and I did that experiment, and it turned out very well. And Richard Herrnstein, who was then, at that point, he was still an assistant professor or an instructor there. He thought it was a good experiment, and he said, sort of offhandedly, it's not really enough for a thesis. I had never had any idea that it was going to be enough for a thesis. But I said, well, I'm going to do some more. And I did some more, and finally I did have enough experiments for a thesis. And at the same time, I was doing experiments in psychophysics in the laboratory of S.S. Stevens. And I had enough experiments there also to do a thesis. And I decided just for no good reason, but for a reason, because the woman who was in charge of the psychophysics laboratory, Stevens was in charge, but his wife was his secretary, and she was sort of, I wouldn't say she's a mean woman, she was sort of strict, and I was afraid of her.
Yes.
So I felt I would rather be in Skinner's lab, and then they offered me to be an assistant professor there. I got my degree, and I could stay on as an assistant professor. And then I had to make a choice. I felt I had to make a choice. I couldn't do experiments in both areas. So I just kept going in Skinner's laboratory. And even then, I would not have called myself a behavior analyst or a Skinnerian even. I was just doing experiments more for the fun of it. I
Mhm.
thought, you know, people were doing it, and I was
Yeah.
interested in the interactions I was having. I was interested in doing experiments,
Mhm.
but I was not a serious behavior analyst. So finally, after it was 4 or 5 years as an assistant professor, it was clear that I was not going to get tenure at
Mhm.
Harvard, and I looked for another job, and I found one at Stony Brook, and I came to Stony Brook, and by that time, there were many challenges. The cognitive revolution was occurring, and people were challenging behaviorism, and at that point, only at that point, I mean, I was already an associate professor and had tenure, did I start thinking seriously about what I was doing, whether it was really worthwhile, whether it was worthwhile from the point of view of where it was going, the practical applications, and whether it was worthwhile as a sort of a scientific enterprise. And the more I thought about it, the more I liked it. The more I thought that, well, I don't care about these criticisms. They don't make any sense to me. These people who are criticizing behaviorism don't really understand it. And so I became more doctrinaire only at that point. Only at that point.
So what was your training like as a behavior analyst once you made the
Well,
transition?
my training was the standard Harvard graduate student training. You get in. I'm sure other people, once you come in, you're not. They did not divide you into who you were working for or what you were doing during the first year that you were there. You were just a graduate student, and you went around to different labs doing different work in different places, and that's the way they trained you. And then you went to there was called a pro seminar, where the different faculty members come in one after the other and treat it as a seminar. You give reports and learn what they're interested in. And then after the first year or after the second year, in my case, I took it after the first year, preliminary exams, and you take them in 4 topics, and I took them and passed them after the first year. And then after that, they left you alone. They really didn't, once you passed the prelims, that was it. You had to pass a French, you had to take a language exam in those days, not anymore. And one of the reasons I had originally gone to engineering school was to avoid taking a language. I'm very bad at learning languages. I had taken high school French and did very badly in high school French, just barely got by. And I was terrified. I had to learn one language at a high level, which meant really being proficient in the language, or 2 languages where you should be able to translate. And I knew none. I knew none. I had high school French. And I decided to try to pass French at a high level. I had no hope of learning another language. So I started taking the exams, and fortunately for me, the person grading the exams was Skinner. Otherwise, it would have been Stevens or Newman or these other people there who were much tougher. Skinner didn't care. He didn't believe in the language exams either, so he was just going through it. And but even still, you had to take a whole series of exams. And some of them were not graded by Skinner. Some of them were graded by the university itself. And I just managed to squeak through. And finally, the last one was a conversation. You're supposed to hold a conversation in French with Skinner, who was very fluent in French. and I was hardly fluent. I'm very bad. So he would say something, and I would sit and think, what is he saying? What is he saying? I'd try to translate it in my head. Then I would form in English a response, and then I would translate my response. So he would say something, and about 3 or 4 minutes later, I would say something, and then he would respond immediately. And then finally he said, "Get out of here." I just left. But by then, they'd already offered me a job, so they weren't going to. So they just let me go. And when I went to my first faculty meeting, the first thing I did was I raised my hand and I said, "I'd like to propose abolishing the language exams." And they actually took it seriously, and they were considering it. And actually, if it weren't for some of the other assistant professors, the senior faculty would have been happy to have got rid of the language exam. But they kept it. They kept it. And finally, I think they got rid of it. I think every place is now rid of the language exam.
So what was it like to be a behavior analyst during your early years working in the field?
Early years, those were the days. This is now I got my degree in 1965. And during the time I was at Harvard, that was from 1965 to 1969. During those years, operant conditioning, behaviorism in general, was riding very high. So it was nice. It was good. In those days, people, it was easy to get jobs for graduate students. Now it's much more difficult for graduate students to get jobs. So, so that was good. And then later on, as I said, when people started attacking, it became a little more difficult. But I never had my feelings wrapped up in the future of behavior, or the success even of behavior analysis. I was doing it because I enjoyed doing it. For me, it was always a private thing. It was a game. And there were advantages and disadvantages. The advantage was that I could always do my own thing. I always did what I liked. If I was doing some research, and I never did the research because I felt it must be done. I did the research because I enjoyed doing it. I enjoyed thinking about it. I enjoyed writing about it. So that was the good part. The bad part was I was sort of fiddling while Rome burned. I did not. I could have tried harder to promote behavior analysis at Stony Brook, where I was. But I didn't, and so behavior analysis, Stony Brook, when I came there, was known for behaviorism, behavior analysis, and now, when I retired from teaching there, that was the end. There really are no behavior analysts as such there. Well, maybe 1 or 2 in the clinical area.
Cool. So what do you consider your most important, or some of your more important contributions to behavior analysis?
I think along with, I shouldn't only call it mine, but along with George Ainsley, the notion of self-control as related to discounting. I think that's an important contribution. Second contribution is the relation of behavior analysis to economics, economic psychology, or economic behaviorism, or behavioral economics. Now, a lot of people call themselves behavioral economists, but they're really cognitive economists. They're not behaviorists. But I think what I tried to do was to create a bridge between economics and behavioral psychology, and I think that's those two areas: the area of self-control, the area of behavioral economics, and a third area that I'm very interested in now is sort of a sub-area of behavioral economics, game theory and its relation to behavior and social interactions, dyadic social interactions, also multiple social interactions, social cooperation, that whole idea, and behavioral psychology.
I see. And so, based on some of that, what aspects of that type of research do you feel is geared towards cultural analysis and things of that matter?
Well, cultural analysis, I haven't gone that far. I'm still in the lab, but I think also my work, especially recently, has come into interaction with evolutionary theory. So I look at behavior as evolving. And this, originally, this is sort of an extension of the earlier work of John Staden. Staden and Simmelhog, that paper was very influential on my thinking, more than I thought at the time. At the time, I thought it was a good paper, but I didn't realize how important it would be for me. And I think actually I have extended it in a way, and John Staden has gone in another direction. And I think the direction I've gone is much more consistent with that idea of behavior as an evolutionary process, evolution of behavior within the lifetime of the organism, and based on the principles of variation and selection. Yeah, and the notion there's an interaction between the concept of group selection and self-control. That is, behavior in patterns selected, just as groups can be selected in evolution of species, so groups of behaviors, patterns of behaviors, can be selected as such.
As a unit itself.
As a unit, even when the individual behaviors are not adaptive. If the unit is adaptive, then it could evolve as a unit, even though the individual components may be maladaptive or not adaptive. So that's a connection to cultural law.
That's pretty exciting. So what changes have you seen, or how do you think the field of behavior analysis has changed over the years?
Yeah. Well, it's changed. It's interesting. I think it's sort of gone in two directions, up and down. Down in academia. I think in academic life, academics getting jobs at universities, it's become much more difficult. So difficult that I would say that I hate to say this to a young guy, but if I were your age, I would not. I don't know. Who knows what I would do? But much more difficult now than it was in my day. Much easier to get jobs, to get promoted, to do your work. that's on one hand. On the other hand, I think the applied area, as in ABBA, is flourishing. And if I had my choice, which should be flourishing, the applied or the academic, I would pick the applied anyway. So I'm very happy about that, and I think if you had asked Skinner, I think he would be equally happy about that. And despite what I just said about the academic area, I was just at Squab today, and it was more crowded than I have ever seen it. So that's the academic area. I mean, that's quantitative analysis. These are most people who are interested in, not in applied, but in the more abstract aspects of behavior analysis. And there's a lot of interest, a lot of people. As Squab is getting more populated. I think there were 200 people, which is a lot for us. I remember when it started out at Harvard, Michael Commons and Dick Herrnstein. I think Herrnstein called me up and said a few of us are getting together at Harvard, and there may have been 20 or 30 people in the initial meetings, and it's grown a lot, and so I'm happy about that. The only thing is I just regret to some extent that I wasn't more active in trying to promote it. I always said, the reason I never did was I always said to myself, well, I quit engineering for this. If I wanted to be an administrator, if I wanted to do administrative work, then I should have stayed in engineering. I could have done that there. Now what I wanted to do is fiddle around in the laboratory, and I'm going to fiddle around in the laboratory, and the field will have to take care of itself. So that's been my attitude. It has its good aspects and it has its bad aspects.
So what things, if you could go back, do you think that you might do differently that you've done over your career?
Well, I think I could have done a little more. I could have done a little more. I'll give you an example. In 1970s, well, when I came to Stony Brook, as I said, it was known as a behavioral place. And the person who established the department, Harry Kalish, was a behaviorist. He wasn't a Skinnerian, but he was a behaviorist. And every graduate student had to take 1 year of learning. Had to take a 1 year learning course. And when I came, I taught that. I taught 1 semester of that course. And it was hard for a lot of them because they came to graduate school, they may not have had it, or they may have been just interested in clinical psychology and not in animal learning, which I was teaching. So I was teaching that, and then so I came in 1969, 1969. And then in 1976, I had a sabbatical, and I spent it at Stanford, the West Coast. And when I came back, the learning course was not being taught. It was no longer a requirement. And I could have, I think if I would have fought, I could have reestablished it. It was like they did it, but I think they were just, it's like Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia. You know, he did it, but if someone would have resisted, he would have gone. He would have retreated. They didn't resist, and I didn't resist. So that was one thing I could have done. I could have. This is within Stony Brook again. I could have done a little more in the way of administration. I could have been chairman of a department. I never became chairman. I mean, in a way, that was bad. But in a way, when I look at what happened to the other people who became chair of the department, they all burnt out. They hated it. No one liked that job. It was a terrible job in many respects, and I never did become chairman. I always avoided administrative jobs as much as I could, and so as a consequence of that, I really can't complain that that behaviorism decreased at Stony Brook. And then in the wider field, again, I could have done more administratively. I could have taken a more active part in Squab and ABBA. I mean, I didn't go to ABBA for many, many years. Should have probably done that, and could have done things like, for instance, what Phil Heinlein has done, try to promote the field in other areas.
And what do you see as the future of behavior analysis, or where do you see behavior analysis going as a field?
Yeah, I'm hoping that the applied areas will continue to grow. I have no good sense of where they're going, but I'm also hoping that in the more theoretical areas, in Squab, not only Squab, but just in general in the more theoretical areas, that it will come back again. Behaviorism will come back again. Maybe the cognitive people, and I see some of that happening. Some of them who may have been behaviorists at one time and became cognitive, and now I think they're getting tired of it. I think that there are too many theories there. Every psychologist is his own theoretician. In a way, that's true about operant conditioning too, but it's worse. It's worse in cognitive, and I think they're becoming aware of it. I noticed that, for instance, that Walter Mischel is speaking at ABBA. Walter Mischel was behaviorally oriented. His original work was against the concept of personality. Then he became a cognitive psychologist, but he's working in my area, self-control, and I know him very well. And he is now speaking to us at ABBA, and I think that's a sign that he's becoming more behavioral again. And I see us maybe even entering, in a way it's a pity that behavioral economics is dominated by cognitive psychologists right now. Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize and who does very interesting, fascinating work, still calls himself a cognitive psychologist, and there are people at Carnegie Mellon who are cognitive psychologists who are behavioral economists. But there's another area, the area, for instance, represented by Gary Becker, who's speaking again, someone speaking to ABBA, where he feels that behaviorists are more, that economics has more to learn from behaviorists than it does from cognitive psychologists. And so I think the future lies there. I would hope that economics and behavioral psychology would combine, because I think that's where a lot of the, aside from the clinical payoffs, things like autism, which is great that behavioral techniques are the best techniques, but I think in behavioral economics is where the ultimate application of behaviorism is going to be.
So you're starting to see more collaborative efforts across fields?
Yes, I think so. I think so.
And what message would you like to send to students of behavior analysis of the future? What message would you like to give them?
Well, be of good cheer. And don't isolate yourself from the more theoretical areas. A lot of students of behavior analysis are so empirically oriented that they know only one thing, and you can go out on a limb, and someday someone could cut that limb off. I mean, if tomorrow they discovered a pill that you could give to kids and they wouldn't become autistic, then what would happen to all these guys? They should be more generalists, not get out on a limb, and that's always a temptation. Because you're working hard, you're studying, and especially once you get out of school and nobody's giving you an exam, there's no impetus to read widely, to understand widely, and the advice that I would give them is force yourself to do it. It's what Becker calls a positive addiction. It's reading, keeping up with the field, is pleasurable only when you keep doing it. The demand is elastic, but as you do more, the price gets lower. So as the price gets lower and the demand is elastic, you're going to buy more. So you buy more and the price still gets lower. And the demand being elastic, you're going to buy still more. And that's what he calls a positive addiction. The more you do it, the cheaper it gets. So I advise people to do that, to
get
keep
that
up,
feedback loop.
keep up with the field, read JF, and as I said, be of good cheer.
So did your approach to teleological behaviorism emerge from the data or from other experiences in your life?
Oh, well, that's a good question. I think maybe from other experiences and the data. But maybe, as Skinner said many times, he never took credit for anything that he did. He always said it was a sort of the environment acting upon his behavior. And I think that's true about teleological behaviorism. When I was studying philosophy at the New School, there were a lot of Gestalt psychologists and what's the word for the philosophers? What are they called? Phenomenological philosophers. And I absorbed a lot of that. And I always retained an interest in philosophy and read philosophy. And I started to read Plato, and I started to read Aristotle, of course in translation, right? I wasn't going to learn Greek or Latin. And I felt as I read Plato and Aristotle that these guys, even Plato, I mean, he is Skinner hated him. He called him the founder of the mind, the person who invented the mind. But I felt that there was behaviorism there. Not so much maybe in Plato's philosophy, but in the ways Greeks thought in those days. This was pre-Christianity, and they didn't have the Christian notion that you could be good inside, that goodness and badness was something inside you. They really had the notion that goodness and badness was something you did, and that was in Plato, And it was in Aristotle, I felt very strongly. And I did study a little of Aristotle and Plato when I was in the New School. I also took a few courses in Columbia. A man named Randall, who was a real Aristotle expert. I took a course by him. And this was when I was a philosopher, but I remembered all these years what they had said, and then I went back and reread these people, and people have said people have read all sorts of things into Aristotle. I mean, you could even St. Thomas Aquinas read Christianity into Aristotle, but I read behaviorism into Aristotle, and I felt that he was really a behaviorist, and so that gave me a lot of heart, because he's such a great philosopher, so respected too. So you could use his name. You say, well, look, it's not me saying this; it's Aristotle saying it. So. That's how I gained confidence, and of course Aristotle's philosophy was teleological. Final causes he felt were primary before efficient causes, and of course the Renaissance changed that. But it went too far. In understanding the physical world, they're right. I mean, we never got where we are without the Renaissance and modern physics and efficient causes. But even modern physics, quantum theory, is a final cause type theory. Field theory, a final cause type theory. And with respect to humans, with respect to psychology, we haven't gone through the efficient cause state. We're still in a state where final causes are the best way of understanding human behavior, I think. And it could be scientific. So you say, well, if it's final causes, it's not scientific. It is scientific. Economics, utility functions are final causes.
And do you have some interesting memories you'd like to share about Skinner or Herstein, or funny things, or just anything related to your history or experience?
Let's see. Skinner, we had such very little interaction with him. I felt he was a nice person, but he was distant. He was distant from us, the most famous person in the world, and I never really could get close to him. Herstein was very close to me, and I is one of those situations where I felt I remembered everything he said. I treasured my time with him. And I would knock on his door, and if I had an idea for an experiment, he was very generous with his time, very generous with his reputation in a way, and never insist on putting his name on any of my papers, nothing like that. Very free with ideas, and I liked him a lot as a person. A lot of people didn't like him as a person. There was something about him that rubbed many people in the wrong way. I felt he was cold in some ways. I never felt that. I always felt he was nice to me. He was nice to me, and of course he was an inspiration. And despite I didn't agree with a lot of his political views. But I didn't know much about those areas, and what I knew about the areas that I knew, what a pigeon would do in the lab, what the results of an experiment were likely to be. I've never known him to be wrong, so I grew to admire him, and um, remembered what he said when I was with him. And I ultimately edited a book of his. He was. I knew he was preparing that book, and when I heard that he had cancer and he was dying, I called him up and I asked him. I said, "Look, I know you're writing a book of. You're preparing a book of your papers. Would you like me to help you do anything?" He said, "Great," and he sent me his list, his Vita, with stars, with the ones he wanted to include in the book. And I included most of them. Some of them I didn't include, and some that he didn't put stars on, I put in because I felt I wanted it to make a story. And I followed his method. He wrote a book of readings from history, source book in the history of psychology with Boring. And I made it sort of like that, introductory material in between the sections of the papers, and a general introduction. And so I'm very happy to have done that.